So this is a little bit of a side trip into the diversity of flowers. I know we talk about flowers a whole lot. Flowers are among the most important features for diagnosing plant families. So it goes way back. Carl Linnaeus, when he first set up this classification system for plants, he based his classification system on flowers. So basically the kinds of organs, the numbers of organs you can find in a flower, whether organs are fused together, and so on. These are pretty diagnostic. They tend not to change over longer, sort of bigger evolutionary periods of time. So they can be diagnostic for plant groups, as we've seen. Some plant families have a kind of flower that just tells you right away that you have that kind of plant family. And other times, at least, it can help you narrow down the situation. So just a little bit more detail on flowers and pollination for today, a little side trip away from diversity for once. So diagnosing plant families, as I said before, we've got lots of features that we often use to identify a plant family. So this isn't really up to us. It's a matter of kind of matching what evolution has given us with features that are the easiest to observe. So if there was one thing you could observe in every single plant family, if it was just like, boom, right away, the most obvious thing, you'd want to use that to classify your families and say, okay, we have this group and they share this feature. And we noticed that there's this transition from an earlier version where people more imposed their idea of how plants should be classified. And the modern idea is that we want to match our classification system to these evolutionary groups, so clades, monophyletic groups, as we find them on phylogenies. And a lot of times those match up, and that's great. Sometimes we've had to make some adjustments to how we classify different plant groups. So an example here, you've got the plant family, maybe you remember it from not too long ago. This is Araceae. And it's got this monocot feature of parallel venation, and it's got this distinctive inflorescence type. So this kind of inflorescence right away among all plant families in the whole world, this kind of stands out. You've got this colorful bract, the spathe, and then this fat spike, the spadix, with these tiny flowers in it. Very distinctive for a whole family of plants, and this is a very large family of plants. So sometimes you get lucky and you can just, boom, diagnose them right away. Other cases, this is another one we've seen before. This was treated as its own family. The milkweed family was called Asclepiadaceae, and now it's been lumped into that bigger family, Apocynaceae. And this kind of flower, again, very distinctive. So it's got radial symmetry, 5 perianth parts, but then this coronal hood, as we saw before. This kind of appendage, very distinctive, as well as the presentation of pollen in those pollinia. We also see in this group often, but not always, milky sap, giving them the name of milkweeds. And so you've got lots to go on in this plant family. So I want to think about today, not just what the features are for identifying these groups, but kind of why they exist. And so to have this kind of flower, it's a little bit of inheriting from the common ancestor. There might still be a characteristic of this inflorescence that's distinctive of the broader group this belongs to. For example, the number of perianth parts. And then there'll be some features that are distinctive to this smaller, more specific group, such as the coronal appendage, the pollinia. These are all pretty distinctive features. And so you can ask yourself the question, well, how did they get there? You know, they didn't just evolve so that we could have an easier way to identify this plant group, but they had evolved probably, in a lot of cases, we assume and sometimes can demonstrate that these evolved under pressure, some kind of selection. So it's not just haphazard, interesting way to build a flower, but this flower is really highly contrived to maneuver the pollinators into a position. They stick their appendages in these hoods and they get the pollen on them. And that really helps out the plant. So really changing its form to achieve this specific kind of pollination. That's the reason we have these kinds of flowers. And sometimes they're awful diagnostic. This is a family we haven't got to yet this semester. This is a dogwood family. Maybe I'll skip over this one, but it's got characteristic inflorescence type, leaf venation, phyllotaxis, helpful traits. Orchid family, again, very distinctive. You've got numbers of organs, but then also just the fact that they're highly modified. Some of these, the column here and the labellum of this otherwise three-parted flower. So 3 petals, 3 sepals behind, but the high modifications of the petals are pretty distinctive to the orchid family, Orchidaceae. So some of those features are going to be unique, as we saw, and some of these features are going to be more convergent. So here's an example of a couple of shrubs that have pretty similar fruits, right? So we've got fruit color, fruit size is not so different. The arrangement of them in rather abundant clusters. So you could ask yourself the question, well, why would they look so similar? Is it just random, or is there something going on from selection that causes them to be this way? Well, as you can guess from the title of this slide, this is a feature that you would suppose is resulting from convergent evolution. And the understanding here is that one of these plants, or maybe even a different plant, figured out a signaling to animals that are going to come eat these fruits and disperse them. So not just any animal, but ideally an animal that is effective at transporting the seeds without destroying the seeds, being attracted to them, and so on. So this color is kind of an attraction. It's a signal to an animal, says, I've got a juicy, tasty fruit here that's nutritious, and I'd like you to come eat these. These are probably effectively dispersed by birds, maybe bears in a couple cases, but they're converging on a pretty similar appearance. So you take advantage of an animal that's already got an instinct to eat this kind of thing, and you sort of latch on by figuring out how to be appealing in the same way. And from classification standpoint, this can be troublesome. So convergent evolution is one of the biggest enemies of effective phylogenetic classification, is because we're sort of tempted to say, I've got these things, they look alike, they must belong to the same group. Well, in a lot of ways, I would just encourage you, if you're ever classifying your own plant groups, I would encourage you to kind of downplay the things that are most obvious. So this plant is drawing the attention of animals. And in doing so, it kind of draws our attention as well. And as we just discussed, this is in place because they're evolving toward the same thing. They didn't start from a same common ancestor with this kind of fruit. And it's actually pretty common for something under high selection, like seed dispersal, pretty common for different plants to arrive at the same conclusion. So just sort of keep that in mind, that you might in some ways sort of be tricked by these plants. So really the best way to understand how plants got to have the forms they do is to put them into a phylogenetic context. So I know we talk about phylogenies a lot in this class. This is just a really effective tool, a very modern tool for taking a new perspective on classification. So you can take these plants and say they look alike or they don't look alike. And with a phylogeny, you can group them and say, do the ones that have a similar feature, did they inherit it from one common ancestor, or is there something else going on? So this is a group of plants in a family that's not too far away from the banana family. And they've got these big bracts and flowers that are mostly hidden inside of those big bracts. This is a tropical plant, so these are almost like a plastic texture, pretty tough texture on these big bracts. And what's shown is the flower presentation has 3 different forms, as they're defining them here, based on whether the inflorescence is hanging, this one here called pendant, versus stiff and supporting itself upright. These are erect inflorescences. And then another feature having to do with whether the flowers are what we call resupinate. And resupinate means that they've flipped upside down, basically. So this is the not flipped upside down version, has the pollen presentation on the bottom side. This kind of flower is flipped the other way and has the pollen presentation on the upper side. So you can imagine being visited by a hummingbird, which is a common pollinator of this kind of plant, that this kind of plant would dust pollen on the top of the pollinator's face, and this kind of pollen would end up on the bottom of the pollinator's face. In a phylogenetic context, I've got these colored by their different categories, and we can see there's a reconstruction. These little pie charts reconstruct what the ancestors probably had. And it's very common to have this orange. So going way back, it basically is reconstructing the ancestor here with the orange feature, which is resupinate and erect. So this is reconstructed as the ancestral version. And then these other ones became that way by switching basically to optimize their pollen presentation, or maybe to avoid competing with this kind of pollen presentation. So the same hummingbird could visit both kinds of flowers and get pollen from two species on two parts of its body. That's a pretty good way to avoid competition. So one change here to the blue, which is non-resupinate and erect. And then in the purple here, a different change to non-resupinate and pendant, sorry. And still not many changes. So this is a rather complex change that happened in the ancestor and then stuck around in all the descendants. Over here in blue happened in the ancestor and stuck around in all the descendants. So nice pattern to understand how these came about. Other features here you can do, as we talked previously in phylogenetics, you can estimate whether some changes, some morphological changes are associated with increased speciation. And so that's sometimes an indication that new feature evolved and was quite advantageous. So here we've got some coloring on the ancestral nodes of this tree into these different members of family Hypericaceae, the St. John worts. That kind of tells you if you've got increased speciation, that can kind of support the idea that the evolution of a new feature was advantageous and potentially under selection. Oops. We've seen aquatic plants, just want to highlight this again. So lots of instances of plants becoming aquatic because there's a clear advantage to ending up in that strategy, and lots of different plants across the phylogeny of flowering plants have become aquatic. It's an important change, a difficult change, but maybe in the scheme of things, not the most difficult thing for a plant to become aquatic, just a matter of managing how it deals with gas exchange and a few strategies for maybe floating or getting nutrients out of the water, what have you.